Mij Rahman, Managing Director for Europe, our Don of all things Europe at Eurasia Group, and my friend and colleague. It's really nice to talk to you. Thanks for doing this.
Great to be here, Tony.
So, look, there's been kind of a key mantra across this whole conference, unity, unity. Europe is standing together. Obviously, a huge U.S. coalition, the biggest since 1963, I heard, and everybody's sending a message of support for Ukraine. I was really struck yesterday. Obviously, we heard from Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister. She made this really astute point that that's true, but it's a very different experience when you're in the Baltics right now than if you're, say, Spain. What are your observations?
So I agree with you in terms of the public message and the public frame. Coalition unity is extremely important. That's almost a public good in and of itself. But of course, there are deep internal differences between different blocks of the European Union, given geographic location, historical context, etc., etc. That relates to the trajectory of the conflict. You'll have seen yesterday in Emmanuel Macron's intervention, he talked about the need to reinforce Kiev's ability to win the war, but also gave a nod to Russia and the negotiations that will follow and the need for the Europeans and the Russians to ultimately come to some kind of security architecture accommodation, which is interesting and will not have gone down well in the Baltic states. There are also differences of opinion around Ukraine's European perspective. How quickly or not should negotiations begin to get Ukraine integrated and absorbed into the European Union? Of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, they'd like that timetable to be accelerated. In Western Europe and other parts of the EU, there are more reservations. And then another area where there are differences is over the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. How much is needed? What are the objectives? Is this a complete reprofile of the Ukrainian economy? A complete repurposing? Is it rebuilding every school and hospital that's been devastated as a result of Russia's war of aggression? There are competing views. Of course, that has an impact on the amounts. That in turn has an impact on where that financing is going to come from. So these are some of the conversations that have been happening in the margins of the MSC, one level below that public narrative that, as I say, is really important for the coalition to articulate and try and sustain.
With Ukraine dominating the headlines, of course, not just here on this continent, but all over the world, Brexit, which was such a major story for so long, and I know you covered it extensively, hasn't been as front and center, but I'm sure it's played a part here, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yes, I'll say there's a couple of observations there. So Sunak is in town, and part of the reason Sunak is here is to have some bilaterals with European Commission President, other leaders. He just met Olaf Scholz to try and finesse some of the final detail around that agreement. I think in particular around the role of the European Court of Justice in policing the agreement that was struck in 2019. That's a positive thing if the Europeans and the Brits can put the Brexit wars behind them and move the agenda forward and have a more positive forward-looking agenda. But it does also, I think, indicate, and this is my second observation, the extent to which Brexit has proven to be a distraction. The big conversation here today is about Ukraine. It's about the trajectory of the conflict. It's about concerns that the Russians are running a war economy. There's an ammunition gap. Europe needs to further develop its industrial capabilities and productions to be able to fill those ammunition gaps. These are the big strategic questions that folks are focused on. And Sunak is, of course, speaking to those issues, but is also spending a lot of time talking about a more defensive domestic issue, i.e. the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think it suggests and demonstrates the extent to which Brexit is still an issue, still a distraction, still something that actually fundamentally subtracts from the UK's ability to be global Britain.
Of course, Sunak also faces some challenges from another northern neighbor, right, Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon had been such an opposition voice. She, of course, resigned recently. What impact do you think that's going to have?
It's quite straightforward. Sturgeon's resignation is complicated. The reasons for it are complicated. The implications are really straightforward. It's really good for Labour. The big barrier to a Labour majority is their performance north of the border. That constraint is largely due to SNP Labour competition. So I think this is probably a surprise gift for Keir Starmer. It really creates, I think, the possibility or increases the probability of a Labour majority government next year. Our base case is Labour will win very hard for Sunak. The question is whether it's a minority or a majority government. I think the odds of the majority government go up. It's bad for independence. Sturgeon was a really effective and clear communicator of the independence mission. Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, in the process of passing legislation that will enable at least an advisory referendum. That was the commitment over the medium term. And the government was in the business of producing a prospectus on how all of the difficult questions around independence would be answered. That was all as a result of Sturgeon's leadership and initiative. A lot of that will now be lost. And I think whoever succeeds her will not be as competent or as capable a champion of the independence mission that Sturgeon was. And so I think the odds of independence, short, medium and long term, certainly have taken a hit as a result of her departure.
Joe Biden came into office with a very clear message: America is back. And that message was being sent largely to coalition partners across the Atlantic, right? And I'm just sort of curious, because you spend so much time on the ground listening to what's really happening here. Is the consensus that they believe him, or is the jury still out?
It depends on where you sit in Europe, I think. For the Poles, for the Baltic states, for the Nordic states, I think absolutely America being back, the reinforcement of that security umbrella is really, really important. And they believe, of course, after the mess of Donald Trump, Biden's commitment to the transatlantic relationship is real, and you see that reflected in support for Ukraine. In other parts of Europe, I think the view is a bit more ambivalent. You know, the war has not been good for Macron's vision of a more strategically autonomous, capable, defensively forward-leaning European Union. And so I think the views in Paris are perhaps a bit more ambivalent. I think there's one interesting idea, which is on the security side, there's a lot of discussion around the rules-based order, right? The need for norms that states adhere to and comply by. But in the economic sphere, it's the wild, wild west. And of course, the US's Inflation Reduction Act, that's a real, finger in the eye of the Europeans. This 369 billion the Americans are going to dole out over the next 5 to 10 years to facilitate their green transition has not gone down well in many countries in the EU. And so I think there's a sense that perhaps on the security side, yes, America's playing a more committed role. On the economic side, actually, its behavior is potentially quite destructive for the European Union, and there's a lot of concern about the IRA and Europe's response to it, which people are talking about a lot here in the margins at Munich.
We're here in Germany. I have to just ask you, for how many years was Angela Merkel considered the leader of Europe, right? Not just of Germany. And I'm wondering, in her absence, who you would think has kind of emerged as that voice. Is it Macron? Is it Ursula von der Leyen? And why?
There's none, I think, is the straightforward answer. There is no leader in the European Union today. It's not Emmanuel Macron. I think Macron would like it, but he is in a minority government. There are lots of domestic challenges that he has to face down, not least protests and strikes over his ambitious attempt to reform the French state pension system. So that is subtracting from a degree of his agency at the European level. Olaf Scholz, new chancellor in Germany, or not so new anymore, in a difficult coalition, not a particularly effective communicator, is actually doing a lot more substantively than the government gets credit for, but is not communicating what the government is doing effectively, and as a result, its star and reputation, I think, within the EU has fallen. The institutional leaders, Charles Michel, von der Leyen, have a degree of influence, but I wouldn't say, I certainly wouldn't say they are the leaders of the EU. And so I think there's something of a vacuum. Notwithstanding the fact there is a vacuum, Europe is actually doing, in terms of its war, quite well, in terms of energy diversification, in terms of sanctions, in terms of the military commitment and support, in terms of the financial support, actually on many legs of the European response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, absent coherent leadership, the EU has actually delivered quite a lot. And I think that's pretty remarkable and perhaps says something about the extent to which one prizes leadership and the importance one places on it. Because, as I say, a lot of the policy agenda is still moving forward pretty robustly, even absent that leadership.
Well, the jury is not out on who our European leader is. It's Mij Rahman from Eurasia Group, and thanks as always.
Thanks, Tony.